I wasn't even supposed to be there. At least that's what my mother told the lawyer when I walked through the door. This reading is for named beneficiaries only, she said coldly, as if I were a stranger off the street. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her voice was steady, smooth, and practiced, like she had rehearsed this moment. She looked stunning as always, Vivian Carter, former high society darling of Charleston, South Carolina. Flawless hair, black silk dress, and a pearl necklace that used to belong to my grandmother. She always knew how to look the part. Today, the grieving widow. But I wasn't there for show. I wasn't there for her approval or even for closure. I was there because my father, Richard Carter, made me promise something, and I always kept my promises to him. I took a slow breath, stepped forward, and addressed the lawyer seated behind the long, polished conference table. "I'm Emma Carter," I said evenly, "Richard Carter's daughter, and I have a document I believe you need to see before this meeting continues." He blinked, surprised. My mother's face didn't move, but her eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening just enough for me to notice. The lawyer hesitated, glancing down at the papers in front of him. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter," he said. "Your name isn't listed in the version I was provided by Mrs. Carter." "Because she gave you the wrong one," I replied, and reached into my bag. I pulled out a sealed envelope, heavy, embossed, stamped with a signature in ink that hadn't faded. I placed it carefully on the table in front of him. "This was delivered to me by Harold Green, my father's longtime financial advisor, 1 week ago. He kept it at my father's request. It contains a notarized and state-registered copy of my father's most recent will." The room fell silent. Vivian didn't look at me. Instead, she stared straight ahead, but her fingers curled slightly around the edge of her chair, white at the knuckles. "Richard never mentioned a new will," she said flatly. "He didn't trust you enough to," I said. Still no eye contact. Just silence, measured, calculated. The lawyer looked uneasy, his brow furrowing as he examined the envelope. "This appears legitimate," he murmured. "It's from a different law firm than the one currently handling the estate." Vivian finally spoke again, sharp this time. "This is absurd. I have the legal authority here. There's no need to indulge this." He held up his hand, silencing her. "Mrs. Carter, if this document is what Miss Carter claims, we are legally obligated to review it before proceeding." I sat down slowly, never taking my eyes off her. She still refused to look at me, but I saw it just for a second, the fear. She knew exactly what I was holding, and she knew what was coming. "My name is Emma Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I teach 11th grade English in a small town just outside Asheville, North Carolina. I live in a modest apartment, I drive a used Subaru, and I make my own coffee every morning because it's cheaper than Starbucks. On the surface, there's nothing remarkable about my life. But the story behind my last name, Carter, carries weight whether I want it to or not. My father, Richard Carter, wasn't just my dad. He was a tech pioneer, a self-made millionaire who built a data security company from scratch in the early 2000s and eventually sold it for tens of millions. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of man who flaunted wealth. He wore the same watch for 20 years and still packed his lunch in brown paper bags. But he believed in legacy, and above all, he believed in loyalty. My mother, Vivian Carter, was his opposite in every possible way. Charismatic, image-obsessed, and fiercely controlling, she used to be a marketing executive before stepping away from her career to manage our public face as a family. We weren't celebrities, but in Charleston, where names and appearances mattered, the Carter family was known. My earliest memories were of cold breakfast tables, formal smiles, and staged holiday photos that looked perfect but felt hollow. I loved my father deeply. We had a quiet kind of bond that didn't need performance. He was the only person who really listened when I spoke. He was the one who encouraged me to study literature, who came to every school play, even when he was drowning in investor meetings. He called me his anchor, said. I reminded him of who he really was before the money, before the business. Things started to shift when I was 15. My father began spending more time away on business trips, and my mother grew colder. She would criticize my clothes, my grades, even the tone of my voice. Nothing I did was ever quite enough. When I left for college, I thought maybe putting distance between us would help. It didn't. My father and I kept in close touch. Weekly phone calls, occasional visits, long emails where he asked what books I was reading. But my mother stopped calling altogether. And then when I was 23, they separated quietly. No public announcement, no messy divorce filings, just distance. My father moved into a lake house outside Raleigh. My mother stayed in Charleston. I never asked for details. He never offered them. But I noticed the change in him. He looked lighter, less guarded. We saw each other more during those years. He even came to visit my classroom, once brought donuts for my students, and gave an impromptu talk about cybersecurity. He beamed the entire time. 2 years ago, everything changed again. My father was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's. He was 58. For a man who had always been sharp in control and energetic, the diagnosis hit hard. I remember the day he told me. He tried to smile through it, but his hand was shaking as he reached for his coffee cup. I told him I would be there for whatever he needed. He thanked me, but he didn't ask for anything. That was his way. Quiet suffering, private fears. A few months later, Vivian reappeared in his life. She said it was her duty to care for him, that no matter what had happened between them, she was still his wife. I was stunned. They had been apart for 6 years with almost no contact, but she moved into the lake house, just like that. And suddenly things began to change. Phone calls became shorter. My father's tone grew foggy. He stopped replying to my emails. Vivian said he was tired, that the medication made him sleep more. She said I was stressing him out with my constant questions. When I tried to visit, she claimed he wasn't feeling well, that it wasn't a good time. And I believed her for a while. Because she was my mother. Because I thought deep down maybe she really was trying. But there was something in her voice. Something too smooth, too rehearsed. And when I did finally see my father 6 months before he died, he looked thinner, distant. He smiled when he saw me, but it didn't reach his eyes. And when Vivian stepped out to take a phone call, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. He looked at me and said, "Emma, listen to me. There's a folder. I left it with Harold Green. If anything happens to me, you go to him. Promise me." I promised. And now I understand why. After that last visit, I tried to believe my father was safe. I told myself Vivian had changed, that maybe the distance between us had made me overly suspicious. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The phone calls became rare. When I did get through, his voice sounded slurred, his thoughts scattered. Sometimes he didn't remember that we'd already talked that week. Once he called me by my mother's name. I asked Vivian about the medication, but she dismissed my concerns. "Emma, you're not a doctor," she said with that condescending smile she'd mastered decades ago. "This is just part of the disease. He has good days and bad days. You wouldn't understand." I tried to push for more information, but every question made her colder. She blocked me from speaking directly to his doctors. She told the home nurse that I was too emotional and disruptive. I wasn't even allowed inside the house without notice. One time I showed up unannounced, and she refused to let me in. Said it would agitate him. I waited outside for hours. I never saw him that day. I reached out to Harold Green, my father's financial advisor. He had always been discreet, loyal to a fault, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Emma, I wish I could tell you everything," he said quietly, "but your father made me promise to wait. If something happens, I'll contact you. Until then, be patient." Patience was a luxury I didn't feel I had. Meanwhile, Vivian began making moves, small ones at first. She listed the lake house in her name as the primary resident, even though it had always been in my father's trust. She sold off his vintage car collection, citing simplification. She told neighbors that he was no longer capable of handling his affairs. She hired a new lawyer, Dennis Mallory, known for being ruthless in estate battles. My father never trusted Mallory. I remembered him referring to him once as a man who knows the price of everything, but the value of nothing. Still, Vivian insisted he was the right person to manage things going forward. Then came the moment that still haunts me. I had driven up to the house on a rainy afternoon, convinced I'd find a way in, determined to speak with my father no matter what. When I arrived, the front gate was locked. A new security code had been installed. I called the house phone, no answer. I called Vivian straight to voicemail. I sat there in my car for nearly 2 hours. At one point, I saw a shadow through the upstairs window. I was sure it was him, but then the lights went off. A week later, I got a text from Ethan, Vivian's son, from a previous marriage, my half-brother. We weren't close. Vivian always favored him. "Dad's not doing well," the text said. That was it. No context. No follow-up. I replied instantly, asking what happened, where he was, if I could visit. No response. 3 days after that message, Harold called. His voice was calm but distant, as if rehearsing something he didn't want to say. "Emma," he said, "I'm sorry to tell you your father passed away last night. My world slowed down. It was like being underwater. What? How I didn't even. But he had no details. Vivian hadn't informed me. She'd made the arrangements. Private, immediate family only, no obituary, no church service. Just a small gathering at the house for those who mattered. I wasn't invited. The woman who gave birth to me, who once braided my hair and packed my lunches, had now shut me out of the last chapter of my father's life. And I had no idea why. No reason, no explanation, just silence. Cold, rehearsed silence. But that wasn't the end, because my father knew her. He had known her better than anyone, and he had planned ahead. The night after Harold's call, a courier arrived at my apartment. No return address, just a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Harold. Come see me. Bring identification. Do not tell anyone you're coming. I packed a bag and left the next morning. As I drove through the early fog of the Blue Ridge Mountains, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just held that envelope in my lap, gripping it like a lifeline. Because deep down, I already knew the truth. My father didn't just die. He was pushed out slowly, quietly, methodically. And the person who orchestrated it all was the one who should have protected him. My own mother. I met with Harold Green the following afternoon at his private office, a modest 2-story building tucked behind a row of old brick shops. He looked older than I remembered, more gray in his beard, heavier under the eyes, but when he saw me, his expression softened. Emma, he said quietly, ushering me inside. I'm sorry for your loss. Your father meant the world to me. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He led me into a small conference room and locked the door behind us. No assistants, no distractions. Just the two of us and a small black safe beneath the table. He bent down, turned the dial, and retrieved a thick envelope sealed in wax. He placed it in front of me with both hands. Your father gave me this 6 months ago, he said. Told me to hand it to you personally and only you if anything ever happened to him. My hands shook slightly as I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. Inside I found a printed legal document, a handwritten letter, and a flash drive. The legal document was a certified copy of a will dated 4 months ago, drawn up by a different firm, signed, witnessed, and notarized. My name was listed first. The contents were clear. I was to inherit the majority of my father's estate, including the house, the business assets, and the investment accounts. Vivian was to receive a modest trust for medical expenses, and Ethan a smaller educational fund. But more than the document, it was the letter that stayed with me. I unfolded the pages slowly, recognizing my father's handwriting immediately. Dear Emma, it began. If you're reading this, then I've already gone, and I'm sorry for that. I never wanted to leave you alone in this world, especially knowing who would try to rewrite everything I built. I made mistakes, Em. I thought your mother had changed. I thought in my illness I could find peace by letting go of old pain. But the truth is, Vivian never came back to care for me. She came back for control. I saw it too late, but not too late to act. He wrote about the medications, how they changed without his approval, about how his calls with me were suddenly interrupted, how his finances shifted. He wrote about the new lawyer, about Ethan's sudden presence, about the isolation. I should have listened to you sooner, he wrote. You always saw through people faster than I did. I felt a deep ache in my chest as I read the closing line. You are my legacy, Emma. Not the money, not the company. You. Use this information carefully. Stay calm. Be smart. And don't let her take what's rightfully yours. I sat in that room with Harold for a long time, holding that letter, feeling like my father had just spoken to me one last time. And I knew right then that whatever happened next, I wouldn't let her win. The funeral didn't feel like a farewell. It felt like a performance. Vivian arranged everything at a luxury private venue outside of Charleston, complete with white orchids, velvet seating, and a string quartet playing soft classical music. My father would have hated it. He once told me he wanted something simple like the memorial they held for his college roommate, just friends, a few stories, some laughter, and a shared bottle of red wine. Instead, what he got was a cold, curated event with glossy programs that listed his professional accomplishments and a 1-paragraph note about his loving family. That note didn't include my name. When I arrived dressed in black slacks and the coat he once bought me for Christmas, I wasn't greeted. An usher led me to the back row without asking my name. I recognized some of the people in the room. Old business associates, neighbors from the Lake House community, a few distant cousins, but none of them looked surprised that I was seated so far from the front. They just glanced at me with awkward sympathy, like I was an old friend who had fallen out of favor. Vivian sat in the front row, flanked by Ethan and Dennis Mallory, the estate lawyer she had hired. She wore a black veil and kept dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief that I was almost certain was an accessory, not a necessity. Ethan looked bored. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket, and he ignored it with the kind of indifference that made my stomach turn. When the eulogy began, I waited for someone to mention me, to acknowledge that Richard Carter had a daughter, a child who had been there when he first built his company in the garage, a girl who had helped him test his first software prototype by clicking the same button over and over until her fingers were sore. But no one did. Vivian spoke first. Her voice was steady, slow, dripping with artificial warmth. She spoke of their difficult but enduring marriage, and how she had returned to him in his time of need despite all the pain of the past. She mentioned their family and gestured toward Ethan. She talked about how much my father loved Charleston, how proud he had been of the business he built, how devoted he was to those closest to him. I stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes dry. When it came time to view the casket, I stood up ready to approach, but Vivian's hand shot up sharply. Her lawyer stepped in front of me. "Family first," he said. And just like that, they moved past me. I waited. I stood in silence until the line thinned. By the time I reached the front, the lid was half closed. I got only a glimpse of my father's face, peaceful, pale, unfamiliar. I whispered goodbye anyway. At the reception afterward, I was offered no seat, no speech, no recognition, but I didn't care. I wasn't there to be seen. I wasn't there for them. I was there to look her in the eye, but she never met mine. Not once. Not when she thanked donors. Not when she shook hands with executives. Not even when she walked past me on her way out of the room. She looked through me like I didn't exist. But that was fine. She had no idea what I had. And soon she would. The official will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock inside the law offices of Mallory and Strauss, the firm Vivian had retained shortly after my father's diagnosis. I wasn't invited. In fact, I wouldn't have known about it at all if Harold hadn't called me the day before. "You should be there," he said firmly. "Whether she wants you in the room or not." I arrived 10 minutes early. The receptionist looked surprised when I gave my name, but she didn't argue. A phone call was made behind the desk. A whispered conversation, then a sigh. "Please wait here," she said. At 2:04, the door to the conference room opened and Dennis Mallory stepped out. He looked exactly as I remembered, polished tan, calculating. "Miss Carter," he said, with an apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This meeting was arranged for the parties listed in the will. I understand there's been confusion." I didn't flinch. "I'm Richard Carter's daughter. I have every right to hear what he intended." He looked past me, maybe hoping someone else would appear and make this easier. No one did. "Very well," he said at last, stepping aside. "You may observe." I walked into the room and sat near the back. Vivian was already there, seated at the head of the table like royalty presiding over her court. Ethan sat beside her, looking restless. A few family advisors and a woman I didn't recognize sat along the wall. No one greeted me. Mallory began reading from a leather folder, his tone dry and deliberate. "This is the last will and testament of Richard Henry Carter, dated November 3rd of last year." As he read it, quickly became clear what had happened. The entirety of my father's estate house stocks, intellectual property business assets, was to be placed in a marital trust controlled by Vivian Carter. Upon her death, the remaining assets would be split evenly between Ethan Caldwell and the Vivian Carter Charitable Foundation. My name was not mentioned, not once, not as a beneficiary, not as a trustee, not even in passing. It was as if I had never existed. Mallory finished the reading and closed the folder. "Are there any questions?" he asked. My mother gave him a pleased little nod as if to say, "That went smoothly." She didn't even look at me, but I didn't react. I sat perfectly still. Then I reached into my bag and placed the sealed envelope on the table. Mallory looked at it like it had landed there from another planet. "What is this?" he asked. "A mistake," I said, "or maybe a correction. This is a certified copy of my father's actual will, not the version you were handed by Mrs. Carter." I watched Vivian carefully. For the first time since I walked in, her mask cracked, just slightly. Her eyes narrowed. Her jaw twitched. "This is absurd," she said. "Richard never said a word about a new will." "He didn't trust you to," I replied. Mallory opened the envelope and scanned the first page. His expression changed almost immediately. "This is..." This is dated more recently. It contains revocation clauses, alternate directives, and signatures from witnesses not associated with our firm. He looked up confused. And it names Miss Carter as primary beneficiary. Vivian stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. This is forged, she snapped. It's not real. It's been filed with the state, I said. Notarized, verified, and kept in a third-party vault since December. She went silent. The room did too. But I could feel the panic rising inside her. I wasn't erased. I wasn't gone. I was back. And I had brought the truth with me. The room shifted. The energy snapped from smug confidence to strained silence in seconds. Mallory held the document like it was radioactive. He read it again slower this time, then looked over at Vivian with an expression that barely masked concern. Mrs. Carter, he said carefully, were you made aware of any amendments or updates to Mr. Carter's estate planning after November? Vivian's voice came out tight and clipped. No, that document is false. Richard was already in decline by then. He wasn't thinking clearly. He couldn't have understood what he was signing. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and opened my bag again. Actually, he understood perfectly. He anticipated exactly what you'd say. That's why he documented everything. I slid a small flash drive across the table. On this are audio recordings, handwritten notes, a medication log, and surveillance video. My father knew he was being manipulated. He didn't want to believe it at first, but he saw what you were doing, how the prescriptions changed, how his calls were blocked, how you convinced his care team to limit access to everyone but you. Mallory didn't reach for the drive yet. He looked stunned. What kind of recordings? I turned to him. Private conversations taken from a hidden camera in his study. Conversations between Mrs. Carter and Dr. Stephen Maher regarding altering Richard's medication schedule, and others between Mrs. Carter and Ethan discussing control of the estate. Ethan straightened in his chair, visibly shaken. I didn't know she was recording anything. I never agreed to. Vivian shot him a look that froze him mid-sentence. That's enough, she said sharply. Don't say another word. I faced Mallory again. The will I've given you was drafted by an independent firm, signed in front of 2 unrelated witnesses, and filed with the North Carolina Estate Registry. I have the receipt and certification documents here. It revokes the version you just read. It directs the majority of my father's estate to be transferred into the Carter Family Education Trust, with me named as sole executor. It leaves Vivian with a monthly living stipend and access to a healthcare fund, nothing more. It also includes a clause directing a full investigation into any suspicious circumstances surrounding my father's death. The air felt heavier now. Vivian's lips parted, but no sound came. Mallory cleared his throat and sat back slowly. I'll need to verify all of this through official channels, he said cautiously. Of course, I replied. I've already submitted a copy to the state registrar, and Harold Green has retained the originals. You'll find everything checks out. Vivian finally spoke again, her voice lower, almost a growl. You think you're clever. You think this changes anything. You're still just a bitter little girl who hated that your father loved me. I didn't look away. I never hated you. I pitied you. You needed control more than you needed love. And now you've lost both. She reached for her handbag with a trembling hand and stood. This isn't over, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. It never is, I said, but the truth doesn't go away just because you pretend it doesn't exist. She walked out, Ethan trailing awkwardly behind her. He didn't look back. I stayed seated while Mallory processed the information, his hands slightly shaking as he began flipping through the new will. I apologize, Miss Carter, he muttered. We had no idea. If this proves valid, and from what I'm seeing, it likely is, there will need to be a full reassessment of the estate. The previous directives will be void. I know, I said softly. That's what he wanted. He made sure of it. As I sat in that chair surrounded by legal silence and broken illusions, I felt something unfamiliar rush in. Not triumph, not revenge, just the quiet strength of being heard. For the first time in weeks, I felt like my father was sitting right there beside me. The aftermath was chaos wrapped in silence. Vivian disappeared from public view within 48 hours of the will reading. Her lawyers stopped returning calls. Ethan, once her golden boy, withdrew completely. The estate assets were frozen pending investigation, and Mallory quietly stepped back from representing her. I moved into a temporary rental near the lake house while we waited for court dates to be set. I didn't want to step foot in that house again until I had the full legal authority to protect it. That's what my father wanted. Harold and I began working closely with the firm that had drafted the legitimate will. They verified every signature, every clause, every filing. Nothing was out of place. Meanwhile, Harold provided me with the rest of the materials my father had secretly prepared. Documents, emails, and a long handwritten timeline detailing the changes in his physical and mental state, all cross-referenced with specific events, doctor visits, new medications, canceled appointments, and Vivian's return to his life. He had even kept receipts showing she had picked up prescriptions without his consent. It was all there, methodical and damning. But it wasn't just about paper. There was emotion in those notes. I could feel his fear, his frustration, his loneliness. He had known he was slipping and suspected he was being helped along the way. The surveillance video showed my mother entering his office late at night, rifling through drawers, replacing bottles, making phone calls she never expected to be recorded. On one call, she whispered, "He's starting to question things. We need to get things finalized before he pulls something stupid." I watched that footage alone in a dark room, my hands trembling, my stomach hollow. She had always been calculating, but this was something else. This was cruelty disguised as care, control wrapped in the language of concern. Within a week of the evidence surfacing, I received a letter from her new attorney. It was full of legalese, but the meaning was clear. They intended to challenge the will on the basis of diminished capacity. I expected it. Vivian never gave up ground without a fight. But we were ready. The witness statements were solid. The notary's affidavit was airtight. The state records matched our copy. And then there was the flash drive, the audio files, the logs, the video. One by one, pieces of the truth came together like a slow-moving avalanche. Ethan sent me a text 3 days after the challenge was filed. No greeting, just 6 words. I didn't know it was like that. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Then the threats began. Anonymous emails, texts from burner numbers. Someone tried to follow me home one night in a nondescript black car. I filed a police report. We added private security to my rental. Harold hired a forensic tech to track the source of the digital threats. Most were dead ends, but one message was traced back to a phone registered under a fake name linked to a company owned by Vivian's second cousin. Sloppy, desperate, predictable. I showed the police. They added it to the file. Nothing immediate came of it, but I could feel the net tightening. Vivian was unraveling. Meanwhile, word began spreading among my father's former colleagues and friends. Quiet calls, concerned messages. "We always wondered why you weren't around," someone said. "She told everyone you moved on, that you didn't want to be involved anymore." Lies. All of it. Slowly, the narrative she built started to crack. One by one, the people who had believed her started asking questions. I didn't need to convince anyone. I just let the truth speak for itself. I stayed calm. I stayed quiet. I stayed smart, just like my father told me to. And every step I took brought me closer to reclaiming what had been stolen. Not just the house or the money or the company, but my father's voice, his memory, his dignity. This was never about revenge. It was about restoration, about undoing the erasure, about refusing to be written out of the truth. And I was just getting started. 2 weeks after the legal challenge was filed, I received a voicemail from Ethan. His voice was shaky, uncertain, like someone standing at the edge of something they weren't sure they wanted to cross. "Emma, we need to talk. Not with lawyers, just you and me. Please." I didn't answer right away. I let it sit for a day. Then I replied with a time and place, an old diner we used to visit as kids, neutral ground, quiet. When I arrived, Ethan was already there, sitting in a booth near the back, eyes fixed on his coffee. He looked tired, older than his age, like someone carrying more than he could hold. He didn't speak right away. When he finally did, it wasn't what I expected. "I didn't know how bad it was," he said. "I knew Mom was pushing things, that she wanted control, but I didn't know she was drugging him." I studied him carefully. "You lived there. You saw him every day." He shook his head. "I saw what she wanted me to see. She told me he was getting paranoid, that he wanted to leave everything to you because he wasn't thinking straight. I believed her. I didn't question it." His voice cracked a little. "She used both of us." I stayed quiet, letting him sit in the discomfort of that truth. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a plastic bag containing prescription bottles, half-torn labels. One still bearing my father's name, another marked with a different dosage than what had been on record. I found these in her bathroom, hidden behind the cleaning supplies. They're dated 2 months before he died. I took the bag without a word. I already knew what it meant, but now I had physical proof that tied her to the manipulation directly. Ethan exhaled. I'm not here to beg. I don't want to be part of her lie anymore. For the first time, I believed him. He wasn't innocent, but he was human. And maybe, just maybe, he was trying to make it right. I gave him my attorney's card. Tell the truth under oath. That's how you make it right. He nodded slowly. I will. 3 days later, I was contacted by Rosa Jimenez, a former housekeeper who had worked at the lake house during my father's final year. She had left abruptly around the time Vivian moved in, and no one knew why. Now she was reaching out to me directly. We met at a quiet park away from prying eyes. Rosa didn't waste time. Your father was kind to me, she said. He treated me like family. But after she came back, things changed. He wasn't allowed to speak freely. She made me report everything he said to her. When I refused, she threatened to fire me. I asked why she stayed silent for so long. She looked ashamed. I needed the job. I sent money home. But I kept something. From her purse, she pulled out a small digital recorder. I placed it in the kitchen near the cabinet. I used it to protect myself in case she blamed me for anything. But it caught other things too. I didn't ask what was on it. I didn't need to. Rosa handed it to me with both hands. I heard what she said to him. How she told him no one believed him anymore. That his memory was broken. That she'd take care of everything once he was gone. My stomach twisted. I thanked her, told her she had done the right thing. That night I listened to the recordings. I heard my father's voice, shaky, confused, asking why his pills looked different. And then I heard hers. Cold, measured. It's the same medication, Richard. You just don't remember. Let me take care of you. Don't fight me on this. It wasn't just control. It was erasure. Slowly, carefully, she had dismantled his independence until nothing was left. But now the pieces were coming together, witnesses, evidence, and the truth, no longer hidden, no longer whispered, was almost ready to speak in court. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the first week of May inside a wood-paneled courtroom that smelled faintly of varnish and dust. The judge was Marianne Holloway, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s, with a reputation for zero tolerance and a long history of handling high-stakes estate disputes. I arrived early with my attorney, Caroline Bennett, a former federal prosecutor, known for her meticulous preparation and calm under pressure. Vivian arrived exactly on time, dressed in dark navy and pearls, her expression blank but polished. Ethan walked behind her, but sat on the opposite side of the courtroom. He didn't look at her. She didn't even acknowledge his presence. The hearing began with Caroline presenting the motion to uphold the newer will and invalidate the older one due to the clear revocation clause, later date, and proper witnessing. She submitted certified documentation, state registry confirmations, and affidavits from the witnesses who had been present when my father signed. Judge Holloway reviewed the paperwork carefully, nodding as she flipped through each exhibit. Then came Vivian's lawyer, a younger man named Caleb Royce, who had replaced Dennis Mallory after the fallout. His strategy was familiar attack. My father's state of mind claim, undue influence, and paint me as the manipulative daughter who had taken advantage of a sick, grieving man. Vivian took the stand first. Her voice was soft, deliberate. She spoke of a husband in decline, confused and paranoid, suddenly rewriting his will without telling anyone. She described me as estranged, ungrateful, distant. She never accepted that I came back into Richard's life, she said, eyes glassy with feigned emotion. She resented me for loving him when he needed it most. Caroline stood when it was time to cross-examine. Her tone was quiet but firm. Mrs. Carter, are you aware of the medications your husband was prescribed during the final 3 months of his life? Vivian hesitated. I managed his care, yes. Then you would also be aware of prescriptions that were never listed in his official medical file. Correct? Vivian's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're implying. Caroline stepped forward, placing the prescription bottles from Ethan on the evidence table. These were found in your possession. They contain medications that do not appear in Mr. Carter's records, and their dosage is inconsistent with his diagnosis. Would you like to explain that discrepancy? Vivian looked at her attorney, then back at Caroline. I have no idea where those came from. We also have surveillance footage of you bringing those medications into the home, as well as audio recordings of you discussing getting things finalized before Mr. Carter changed his mind about his estate. Vivian froze. The courtroom was silent. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Are you denying that's your voice on the recording? Vivian didn't answer. Then Ethan stood up from the bench behind her. "It's her," he said loudly. "It's her voice. I recognize it." I heard those conversations. I didn't understand what they meant at the time, but I do now. Vivian turned to him slowly, her expression melting into something raw and wild. "You ungrateful little," Royce grabbed her arm. "Mrs. Carter, please sit down." But she wouldn't. She stood trembling, glaring at me. "This is all your fault. He would have left it all to me if you hadn't poisoned him against me." Caroline didn't even look at her. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we request immediate enforcement of the July will and a formal investigation into the circumstances surrounding Mr. Carter's care." Judge Holloway nodded. "So ordered. The court recognizes the will dated July 15th as valid and enforceable. Mrs. Carter is hereby removed as executor. Miss Emma Carter is appointed as sole executor effective immediately." Vivian slumped back into her chair, her mouth slightly open, speechless for the first time. And I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of everything my father had feared finally at last lift. The judge's ruling didn't end everything, but it cracked the foundation Vivian had built for herself, and the rest came tumbling down faster than I expected. Within a week, investigators from the state's Elder Protection Unit contacted me to review the full set of evidence: Rosa's recordings, Ethan's testimony, the altered prescriptions, and my father's personal logs. They opened a formal inquiry into possible medical fraud, abuse, and financial misconduct. I handed over every file, every video, every note my father had carefully compiled in secret. I had no doubt this was what he had hoped for. Vivian was served with a restraining order preventing her from accessing any Carter estate accounts or property. She ignored it the first time, showed up at the lake house demanding to be let in. I wasn't there, but the housekeeper who now worked under me called the police. Vivian left before they arrived, but not before screaming at the staff that everything still belonged to her. The next day, her lawyer withdrew representation. The day after that, she was arrested. The charges were serious: tampering with medical treatment, falsifying documents, obstruction of legal processes, and suspected financial exploitation. She posted bail, of course. But the image of her being led out of her Charleston home in handcuffs was all over the news within hours. A woman who had once hosted charity galas and garden parties was now at the center of a criminal investigation, and there was nothing elegant about it. The press came knocking, but I didn't answer. I refused all interview requests. This wasn't a story I wanted to sell. It was something I needed to survive. I focused on honoring the will. I took over the estate. I restructured the Carter Business Trust and began transferring ownership of key assets into the educational foundation my father had wanted. I renamed it the Richard Carter Fund for Ethical Innovation, and I made sure every dollar in it would go toward scholarships and grants for students in underfunded communities. The lake house, once filled with shadows and manipulation, began to feel lighter. I restored my father's office exactly as he left it, even down to the books he had stacked beside the window. One afternoon, as I sorted through a drawer, I found a small photo of us from when I was 8 years old. We were standing beside his first server rack, both wearing safety goggles and laughing. On the back, he had written "The beginning of everything." I kept that photo on my desk from that day on. Ethan reached out again, this time more sincerely. He wanted to testify at the criminal trial. He said he owed it to our father. I agreed. He stood in front of the court and told the truth about what he saw, what he ignored, and how long he let himself be controlled by someone he now realized had never loved him the way she claimed. The jury listened. They heard from Rosa, from doctors, from experts who confirmed the drug interactions in my father's system were not consistent with his prescribed care plan. And in the end, they convicted her. Vivian Carter was sentenced to 12 years in prison with additional civil suits pending. She didn't speak at the sentencing. She just looked ahead like she still couldn't believe the world had stopped bending to her rules. I didn't go to the sentencing to gloat. I went because I needed to look it in the eye one last time. I sat in the back of the courtroom, just as I had at the funeral, unseen, quiet still. But this time I wasn't powerless. This time I wasn't being erased. When the gavel struck and the guards led her away, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. The grief didn't leave, but it softened. The weight lifted. And I walked out of that courtroom into a world where my father's voice had finally been heard. After the trial ended and the dust began to settle, I found myself alone in the lake house, surrounded by memories that felt both comforting and haunting. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was peaceful, familiar. Like a long exhale after holding my breath for too long. I moved my belongings into the upstairs bedroom, the one that had once been mine when I was younger. The wallpaper had faded, the furniture covered in dust sheets, but the view of the lake was still the same. Every morning, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the water and imagine my father doing the same. I didn't renovate the house all at once. I took my time. Each room I entered I treated like a conversation. I asked myself what should stay and what needed to go. The cold modern furniture Vivian brought in was removed, donated, or sold. In its place, I brought back the warmth wooden bookshelves, handmade quilts, old family photos that had been packed away or hidden. In the attic, I found boxes labeled in my father's handwriting, Emma's artwork, Emma's school reports, Emma's birthday cards. I spent hours going through them, crying and laughing at the same time. In those boxes, I discovered a man who had quietly cherished every part of my childhood, even when my mother had tried to downplay or control it. He had saved everything. He had never stopped seeing me. One of the last things I found was a notebook. Not a journal, not financial notes, just pages of thoughts, quotes, ideas, reflections on aging, on failure, on love. In the middle of one page, he had written, "Integrity is what you do when no one's watching. Legacy is what they remember after you're gone." I framed that line and hung it above the fireplace. It became the foundation for everything I did after. The foundation began its work that fall. We funded our first round of scholarships, 10 students from low-income families, each pursuing degrees in computer science, data ethics, or public service. Their essays reminded me of why my father built what he did in the first place. Not for wealth, but for impact. I visited each of the recipients personally, handed them the award letters myself, and told them a little about who Richard Carter really was. Not the CEO, not the brand, the father, the man, the one who believed in doing the right thing even when it cost him. Rosa returned to work part-time at the house. She helped me with the garden, made tea in the afternoons, and told stories I had never heard before, like how my father once snuck out to bring her car to the mechanic when she couldn't afford repairs, or how he always insisted on tipping the delivery guys double if it rained. He saw people, she said, not just problems to solve or tasks to manage. He saw them. We built something beautiful from the ashes, slowly, intentionally. People who had once drifted from our lives came back not because of the money, but because they'd finally heard the full truth. They sent letters, shared memories, showed up to the dedication ceremony we held on the anniversary of his passing. We installed a bronze plaque on the dock that read, "In memory of Richard Carter, father builder, believer in better." Ethan came too. He stayed quiet most of the day, standing on the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets. When the ceremony ended, he walked over and stood beside me. "Thank you for not shutting me out," he said. "You could have, and I would have deserved it." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone trying to figure out who he was without her shadow. "You still have a choice," I told him. "Don't waste it." He nodded, eyes glassy, then turned and walked down the dock alone. I didn't stop him. Some journeys people have to take by themselves. Mine wasn't over either, but for the first time in a long time, I was walking forward without fear, with truth behind me, purpose in front of me, and my father's words still echoing softly in my mind. Months passed and life began to feel whole again, not perfect, not without its scars, but real. I took over full management of the foundation and began partnering with local organizations that supported Parkinson's research and elder care advocacy. It felt right to use what had nearly destroyed me as fuel to protect others. Every meeting, every grant, every letter of thanks from a student or a caregiver reminded me of the bigger picture. My father hadn't just left me an inheritance. He had left me a mission. The estate settlement was finalized that winter. The court officially recognized the July will as valid and enforceable. Vivian's name was removed from every title and trust. Her remaining personal belongings were returned to her through her attorney, none of which she had earned, all of which she had tried to claim. I chose not to sell the lake house. I kept it as a living part of his memory. I opened a wing of the house as a retreat space for caregivers of chronically ill family members, offering short stays for rest and support. Something my father had wished existed when he was struggling through the worst of his illness. We called it Richard's Landing. People came from all over, and in quiet corners of the house, I saw them reading books from his shelves, watching the lake through his old telescope, sitting on the porch where he and I had shared some of our most honest conversations. The house, once silenced by manipulation, was full of life again. I received one letter from Vivian, It was handwritten and mailed from the state correctional facility. She didn't apologize, not directly. It was more a performance of guilt than an act of atonement. She wrote about how she had made mistakes, how grief and pride had made her selfish. She wrote that she hoped one day I might understand. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Understanding didn't require forgiveness, and some things didn't deserve a second chance. I kept the letter in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder of how far I had come. Ethan sent updates occasionally. He enrolled in night classes, found work in IT support, and started volunteering at a shelter. He still struggled, I could tell, but he was moving forward. We met for coffee once a month. We didn't talk about her. We talked about books, about work, about small things that built trust, one brick at a time. It was fragile but real. On the 1-year anniversary of my father's death, I stood alone at his grave, a small bouquet of white wildflowers in my hand. The sky was overcast, the air cool and still. I read the same letter he left me. His last words, and then I read him mine. I had written it the night before, sitting in his study, with the window open and the lake breathing quietly in the distance. In it I told him everything, that I kept my promise, that the truth had come to light, that he was remembered not for how he died, but for how he lived. I promised him I would continue the work, that I would honor his legacy, not just with structure and money, but with heart. And when I finished, I whispered, "You were right, Dad. I didn't need revenge, I just needed the truth, and you gave it to me." I placed the flowers down, stepped back, and let the silence speak. No crowds, no photographers, no applause, just peace, real honest peace. I turned and walked away, not with a heavy heart, but with a steady one. The kind that comes from knowing you stood your ground, you honored your word, and you reclaimed a legacy no one could steal. As the season shifted and the lake house settled into its quiet rhythm, I began to understand something I hadn't seen before. Not during the courtroom battles, not even in the months of restoration afterward. Legacy isn't about property names on a trust or framed diplomas hanging in an office. It's about impact, the quiet kind, the kind that ripples outward without announcement. My father's presence remained in the details, the way the light moved through the windows at dawn, the smell of his old leather-bound books, the worn spot on the railing of the dock where he used to stand with his coffee. And somehow, without meaning to, I had stepped into the shape of the life he had once built. But it wasn't about becoming him. It was about continuing what he started, not just his causes or his values, but the grace with which he moved through pain. The way he faced betrayal, illness, and loneliness, and still chose to leave behind something better for those he loved. I hosted the first annual Carter Legacy Fellowship in April, awarding grants to 3 educators working in underserved schools. One recipient, a young science teacher from Atlanta, told me through tears that this money would keep her school's robotics program alive. My father would have loved that, not because it made headlines, but because it made something real. Every time I saw those students learning, every time I received a letter from someone whose life had been changed by the foundation, I felt something more powerful than pride. I felt connected, not to the wealth or the name, but to the core of what my father believed in, that doing good quietly still matters. That integrity has weight. That truth, though often late, always arrives. I kept writing. I started a journal, something I had never done consistently before. I wrote about the days I felt strong and the nights I missed him so badly it ached. I wrote about Vivian, not to dwell on her, but to remind myself how manipulation hides in kindness, and how silence is never protection when harm is happening. And I wrote about forgiveness, not for her, but for myself. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't forgetting or excusing. It's just the refusal to carry the weight any further. One entry I wrote ended with a line that has stayed with me since. She tried to take everything, but she could never take who I became because of him. Sometimes people ask me if I ever really healed. I think healing isn't a finish line. It's a rhythm you relearn. It's the moment you realize you haven't cried that day, and then the one after when you do. But it feels softer, more like remembrance than pain. It's when your memories stop hurting like cuts and start feeling like candles. Some days I still have to sit with the ache, but I'm no longer afraid of it, because I know who I am, and I know whose voice helped me find it again. My mother may have tried to erase me from my father's final chapter, but in doing so, she made me the author of what came next. The lake house is still home, the foundation still grows, the work continues. And when I walk past the dock in the early morning and see the mist rising over the water, I always stop. I let the silence settle, and in that silence, I remember what matters. I remember that wealth is temporary. Power is fleeting, but the choice to love to protect and to tell the truth, that is eternal. That is legacy. That is what remains.